Hello and welcome to the U.S. History Underground. I'm Mr. O'Hagan and I'm here with Mr. Zagari.
How we doing, folks?
Today on the Underground, territorial expansion in the first half of the 19th century. So, Zags, this is not really a new unit. I mean, we are still in the same time period that we've been highlighting over the last month in class or so, right? With the market revolution, the democratic political changes, and even those social changes inspired by the Second Great Awakening.
That's correct, Mr. O'Hagan. We know that all of those developments and changes led to conflict in society. Significant changes never comes without some conflict. But this era is also a pivotal time in American history because of the rapid territorial expansion the country experienced from 1800 through 1860. This was the era of manifest destiny, westward expansion, and of course, intense debates over slavery. So, Mr. O, why don't you set up our discussion with some, as we all know and love, context?
Sure, Zags. Our students will remember that expanding into Western lands and looking for room to grow was a desire as old as the colonies themselves. Heck, the French and Indian War was sparked by British colonists pushing into Indian lands and encroaching on their livelihood. Feeling threatened, those Native Americans called on their French allies to push back, and whammo, French and Indian War.
But that far western land was modern-day Ohio.
Right.
Not exactly the far-reaching western frontier that we think of today.
Right, Zags. And it's not until 1803 and the purchase of Louisiana under the first Jefferson administration that America starts considering this vision of a continental power, a nation stretching from sea to shining sea.
So, is it the purchase of Louisiana that gives rise to the idea we so commonly use to describe the expansion of the 1830s, 40s, that of manifest destiny?
So the idea, yes, but the phrase manifest destiny first appeared in an editorial published in the July-August 1845 issue of the Democratic Review. In that editorial, the writer criticized the opposition that still lingered against the annexation of Texas, which we'll get to later in the podcast, urging national unity on behalf of, and I quote, the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. As the phrase also appeared in a nearly identical context in a July 1845 article in the New York Evening News, its originator is believed to be John O'Sullivan, the editor of both the Democratic Review and the Morning News at the time.
And it is out of that Louisiana Purchase we saw the first conflict arise when Missouri, a slave territory, applied for statehood in 1819. Henry Clay proposed a compromise to smooth things over and admit Maine as well. This kept the number of slave states and free states in equal balance.
But political leaders were very aware that Clay had managed to address a symptom, not cure the disease.
Good point.
Slavery advocates needed new lands to feed the world's appetite for cotton. So, as more territory became eligible for statehood in the future,
more conflict would arise over between those land-hungry Southerners and market revolution-minded Northerners.
Exactly. You know, if you're allergic to a particular food, you're going to have a reaction every time you're exposed to that food. So, new territory, new reaction.
Well, you introduced the topic earlier, Mr. O'Hagan, so let's start with one of those earlier territorial exposures and the subsequent reaction, that is Texas. In the 1820s, Texas was part of Mexico, but it was a severely underpopulated province. American settlers were invited to the territory to increase the land's productivity. Mexico had abolished slavery, but many American settlers in Texas brought enslaved people anyway. This created conflict with the Mexican government, leading to the Texas Revolution in 1836. Texas declared itself an independent republic, but immediately sought admission to the United States.
That's right. Texas's annexation led to a heated debate in Congress. Northern lawmakers didn't want to see more slave states join the Union. They feared it would give pro-slavery politicians more power. Meanwhile, the South argued that Texas had a right to join as a slave state. This struggle set the tone for later territorial debates, while Texas remained an independent country for another 9 years.
And as our listeners may remember from our John Quincy Adams podcast, the House of Representatives was in such turmoil over these heated debates that in 1837, they adopted a gag order which precluded the introduction of any petitions regarding slavery.
Oh, they hated gag order.
And they really didn't like Quincy either.
No, but John Quincy Adams was so outraged by this attempt at censorship that he made it his personal mission to oppose that order. And when the election of 1844 rolled around, many of the major candidates, people like Martin Van Buren, who ends up not getting the nomination from the Democrats, Henry Clay, they both opposed Texas's admission really as a way to hold the status quo.
Right, but they both misread the public mood of the day. James K. Polk, however, did, and he won the Democratic nomination, not Martin Van Buren, because he did take a very strong stance supporting Texas admission, and he beat Clay in the election largely on that public stand.
And how weird is it, too, that Polk was the Speaker of the House 7 years earlier in 1837 and was instrumental in getting that gag order passed, too. So I guess he was a pretty good political operative on behalf of slavery.
Sure.
So Zags, Texas annexed in 1845, and then?
Well, it's followed by another major land gain from the Mexican-American War, which ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The U.S. acquired a massive amount of territory, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. And right away, the question of whether to allow slavery in these new lands became a national issue. It's on the national stage now.
Before that war was even over, David Wilmot, a congressman from Pennsylvania, proposed that any territory acquired from Mexico should be free of slavery. The Wilmot Proviso, as it came to be known, wasn't added to the treaty, but it reignited this fierce debate over the expansion of slavery in the West. Some feared that new slave territories would shift the balance of power towards the South.
Well, what we're going to see here is California. The discovery of gold in 1848 brought thousands of settlers west. By 1850, California applied to join the Union, and now slave states were in opposition because California was coming in as a free state. This led to the Compromise of 1850, where, once again, the great compromiser, Henry Clay, tries to create a compromise to appeal to multiple sides. Utah and New Mexico would come into the Union under the banner of popular sovereignty, meaning that the citizens of the territory would choose to be slavery-free. And California would come in as a free state. This would throw off the balance in favor of free states, but slave states could hope for support in those new territories. This is now becoming a national thing, not just a southern thing.
And not just a local, not a regional concern. You know, ironically, Zach, California sent those two senators to Washington. One was pro-slavery and one opposed slavery. So, ironically, again, the admission of California actually kept the balance. But at this point, tensions are so high over the issue of slavery, nobody's going to let an inconvenient fact like the division of the senators get in the way of their political position.
Correct. And what we're going to see with the Compromise of 1850, it also included a stricter Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens in free states to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people. This outraged many Northerners and increased sectional tensions. And while the idea of popular sovereignty might sound democratic, it only fueled the fire. It was put to the test 4 years later in Kansas and Nebraska. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 organized these territories and allowed the people there to vote on slavery. This led to a violent conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups clashed over control.
Right, you're right. And Bleeding Kansas was like a preview of the Civil War. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces poured into the Kansas territory trying to sway the vote. Violence broke out, and it became clear that too many people in the country couldn't peaceably agree on the slavery question.
The Republican Party actually formed in 1854, directly inspired by the crisis in Kansas and Nebraska. They had a specific plank in their platform opposing the expansion of slavery into the territories. And one quick thing, Mr. L, correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
Wasn't the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas what brought Lincoln back into politics?
Absolutely, it did. It did, and certainly got him involved in the Republican Party. So it really is this kind of spark, this generator to get a real political movement started, and maybe the most important political figure of the middle half of the 19th century back in politics. But let's hit the brakes for just a minute, Zags, because we see these developments, and to me, it always begs the question, how did these slaveholders have so much political influence? They seem to be winning this whole time period. By the 1830s, 1840s, plantation slavery was no longer even capable of producing a lavish lifestyle for slave owners in the Upper South, places like Virginia and Maryland.
Soil was exhausted.
Right. For Northerners, it was an antiquated system that didn't fit in with their market revolution-minded changes. And for Westerners, slavery represented the surest way of blocking a free white man from owning his own farm if all the land was going to be bought up by some wealthy plantation owner. So how did they keep winning?
Well, those slave owners in the Upper South were making money, and that's what it all comes down to. But it was from selling their slaves, not working them in the fields. Is that correct?
But the slave trade was outlawed in 1809, Zags, wasn't it? So that was written into the Constitution.
But here's a little nuance for you folks. The international slave trade, but not the domestic slave trade. Listen to what Thomas Jefferson Randolph, grandson and namesake of the third president, lamented about Virginia. It had become, he said, quote, one grand menagerie where men are reared for their market like oxen for the shambles. But others saw an upside. Thomas Dew, a professor at the College of William and Mary, considered the slave trade, quote, an advantage to the state. It only made sense to slaveholders. To quote, encouraging breeding among the enslaved. Dew finished those thoughts saying, Virginia is in fact a Negro-raising state for other states.
So slavery was immensely profitable even in the Upper South. And I suppose that Westerners still had huge tracts of land north of 3630. So maybe their sense of available land wasn't as desperate as we might think. But what about Northerners, Zags? How do we explain the inability to stem the tide of slavery on the part of Northerners?
Well, we have to remember that economics played a key role, and Southern cotton supplied Northern banks with a ton of capital. Plantation owners made fortunes, and quite often they put those fortunes into Northern banks and Northern investments. Northerners may not have liked slavery, but it wasn't hurting their bottom line. They profited from the influx of the con money.
Zags, I'm reminded of the story of New York City Mayor Fernando Wood in 1860. Wood suggested at that time, after South Carolina and others had started to pull away from the Union and secede, he suggested that New York City should secede along with those Confederate states because of the symbiotic relationship that New York City banks had with the Cotton Kingdom. I guess what that should remind us is that it's easy to lump all the plantation owners in as the bad guys. And don't get me wrong, they were.
Yes.
But they weren't alone. There's an awful lot of people who willingly went along and allowed this to happen because they had their own economic stake and own economic benefit coming out of that. And Fernando Wood reminds us of that.
Absolutely. The North is not innocent in this whatsoever. So, and as long as we're sharing our disappointments, let us remember that for most of the people who oppose slavery, the hardships and injustices being done to the enslaved was a secondary concern. For every William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, or Harry Beecher Stowe, there were scores of white Northerners and Westerners who could live with slavery as long as they could still make their way and enjoy some economic opportunities for themselves.
Right. So we maybe don't do a good enough job of this oftentimes in discussing the time period. Far more whites would have been classified as free soilers, and the abolitionists end up being a very small percentage of the population. So manifest destiny may often be envisioned in the popular culture as this great and glorious path ordained by the heavens, but it forced us to confront the issues that most divided us, and not in a good way.
Absolutely. It would be foolish to think we would have avoided conflict, namely the Civil War, if we hadn't expanded across the continent. But there's no doubt that manifest destiny accelerated us on that trajectory.
That's all for today. Thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel and hit up the like button for all of the content spotlights, unit reviews, A Push on the Road segments, and other spectacular podcasts you'll find on the site. We'll see you next time on the U.S. History Underground.
Take care.